In the Shadow of the Erdtree video, I'm going to be showing you my Gravity Sorcerer build. This is sort of a 2.0 version of our Meteor Mage build that we made way back near the launch of Elden Ring. But in this video, we're going to be adding two new spells added with the DLC. These are Gravitational Missile and Blades of Stone. So we'll be showcasing those spells in this video, along with a couple of other spells you might have seen in the previous video, just to kind of give you a recap in case you haven't played a Gravity Mage before. So the first thing to talk about when talking about a Gravity Mage is which staff to use. I'm using the Carrion Regal Scepter here. This is because it has fantastic sorcery scaling at higher intelligence. We have very high intelligence, 80 with this build, so that's good. And it doesn't have some of the negatives of other staffs like Lusat's Glintstone Staff, for instance, that comes with an increased FP cost, which we don't want. In my offhand, I'm carrying the Meteorite Staff. This gives you a whopping plus 30% damage to gravity sorcery spells, which is all the spells we use that are offensive for this build. So you're absolutely going to want this one in your offhand, and the reason to have it in your offhand is because you simply don't get as much sorcery scaling out of this as you do with the Carrion Regal Scepter. So you don't want to cast with it, but you absolutely want the damage buff from it, so you're going to want to hold this in your offhand when casting. And then lastly, I have the Golden Order Seal here, which uses intelligence and faith, although I don't really care about that. What I'm really using it for, because it weighs nothing, and we can use it to cast Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength periodically. Some of the gravity magic spells, the vast majority of them do physical damage, so sometimes we're going to want to buff with Flame Grant Me Strength to get a little extra physical damage at the beginning of a boss fight or before a difficult encounter out on the landscape or in a dungeon, something like that. And Golden Vow just further increases the damage of our spells when we're in a boss fight or, fighting difficult enemies as well. And also gives us protection, which is good. So next, let's get into the spells themselves before I get into the rest of the equipment. Previously in the other build, there were only 5 spells available. Now there are 7, but there are a couple that I don't think you really need to use. For instance, Gravity Well is simply outperformed by Collapsing Stars. Both of these spells do 100% magic damage and pull the target towards you, but Collapsing Stars does about 40% more damage than Gravity Well, and frankly, when you're fighting DLC enemies, you want to be able to one-shot them with a spell. You don't want to have to cast it twice. This is more FP efficient, and also prevents you from being in the dangerous situation of hitting an enemy, pulling them towards you, and now they're on top of you and you're trying to cast. And the other spell I'm not using here is Meteorite. I have Meteorite of Astal instead. This is a more damaging version. It summons more meteors more quickly, comes at the cost of more FP, but when you have a limited time window to use this, like when you've downed a large boss or something like that, you want to get as much damage out as quickly as you can, especially if you're using the Cerulean Hidden Tier, which removes the FP cost of a spell. So if you pop this right before you do this, you can just hold it down for 10 seconds and just melt things. So let's talk a little bit about Gravitational Missile next. This is one of the new spells. You get this from defeating the Falling Star Beast boss, which is located in Fingerstone Hill, which is kind of behind the statue and Shadowkeep there. So if you went and got him, you'll be able to get this spell. And this spell does 100% magic damage, just like Gravity Well and Collapsing Stars. So you can use Magic Scorpion Charm to boost this, as well as Magic Shroud and Cracked here very easily. And what this does is it shoots out an orb that then kind of pulses, pulling enemies towards it, not unlike what you would see in the Commander Gaius boss fight before detonating in a large explosion. And this can be kind of a difficult spell to use. You can charge it up for extra damage, but a lot of times enemies will run out of the pulses and still get to you anyway. So it's best to throw this in front of enemies so that they can't get to you. Another thing that I learned about this while I was kind of doing this build is that if you throw this like unlocked straight into the ground, it'll detonate instantly. So if an enemy is charging you and you need to do something quickly, just cast this normally, point it at the ground, and boom, it'll usually kill the enemy, and if it doesn't kill the enemy, it'll at least knock them flying so they can't get to you, while you can cast another spell in the meantime. And obviously, this is a great spell for AoEs. If you're trying to throw it into the middle of a bunch of enemies, it can get the job done really well, and it's a nice alternative to Blades of Stone if you want to deal magic damage. So then obviously the other new spell is Blades of Stone. This does physical damage, 100% physical damage. It deals no magic damage whatsoever. And what this does is it kind of summons Blades of Stone that come out under the ground underneath the target. And if you charge it, it'll actually summon 3 in a row that follow the target. So if the target moves forward, it'll try and follow them. If they move backward, it'll try and move past them, etc. So it's really good at tracking the target. A lot of times enemies can move out of it, but what I find is that if you lead enemies and you position yourself accordingly, you can usually even use this point blank. But sometimes you got to get a little tricky maybe and like jump into it so that enemies will follow you back into the AoE. But generally speaking, this is a very high damaging AoE that deals physical damage. It's not super expensive. It costs the same amount of FP as Collapsing Stars, so you could use this as your go-to attack out on the landscape because you have tons of FP with this build, and it AoEs unlike Collapsing Stars. So you can get a lot of enemies at once with this, and I find that this is kind of my bread and butter spell for this build. I use it a lot during boss fights. I use it a lot on the landscape. It's just really, really strong, particularly when you use the charged version, and I would try and use that version of it every time you can. And again, what's really great about that is because it's physical damage, you can buff yourself with Flame Grant Me Strength or Exalted Flesh to give yourself even more damage when casting this. The other spell we use a lot in this build is Rock Sling. This is another 100% physical damage spell. It does fantastic stance damage. It's the only spell in our arsenal that you can use from horseback. So if you like fighting from horseback as a mage, this is the spell that you're going to use. It's kind of difficult to use on horseback, admittedly, but because it has a lot of stance damage, it tends to stagger enemies and stance break them, which gives you an opportunity to deal a lot of damage to them with Meteorite of Astal, particularly if you're fighting like a large dragon boss or any large animal beast type boss. You can stagger them with this spell and then jump down and then use Meteorite of Astal to just unload onto them while they can't move. And you can also pop your Flask of Wondrous Physique if you have the hidden Cerulean Tear in there to just be able to hold down the button for 10 seconds if you can without getting interrupted. And then Meteorite of Astal is a bit unique because it does physical and magic damage, unlike these other spells which either do 100% magic damage or 100% physical damage. So it does a little bit of both. And again, this is a spell that's very situational where you're going to tend to use it on big enemies to rain down lots of meteors and just drain your FP bar into them. So armor-wise for this build, it's not super important what you wear. I don't have a lot of points in endurance, so I kind of have to wear light armor and medium roll with this build. But it's not particularly important. I have the Preceptor's Big Hat tier to give me some mind, which gives me more FP. But you can use any other helmet that increases intelligence or something like that if you want. Otherwise, it's not super important as long as you're able to medium roll. So for talismans for this build, I really have two setups, and one is for like landscapes and dungeons, and one is for boss fights. But the two talismans I use regardless of these scenarios is Graven Mask Talisman to just increase my sorcery damage. That's good no matter which case this is. And Godfrey Icon because this increases the damage you do if you charge up a spell. Collapsing Stars, Gravitational Missile, and Blades of Stone can all be charged, and those are the three spells that I use the most. So you're always going to get something out of that if you charge your spells before casting, and I think that is the most FP efficient way to play this build. Now, if you're out on the landscape or in dungeons, in tandem with those, I like to use the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman to replenish FP over time. This can help just make your life easier if you're exploring kind of methodically and slowly, and can just give you a lot of FP back. If you're someone who rushes constantly, this might not be good for you. But if you're exploring and taking your time, then this is a great one to replenish FP so you can just keep casting spells. The other talisman that I use is Crusade Insignia. Crusade Insignia increases your attack power when you kill an enemy, and since you're constantly killing enemies with this build, you're going to just boost the damage your spells do. And obviously this one is not so good in boss fights. Bosses tend not to have a lot of adds generally, so you don't really get anything out of this in boss fights, but it can also be really good out on the landscape. And if you don't have Crusade Insignia or you want to use another talisman in its place, you could use Ritual Sword Talisman, which just gives you 10% increased attack power while you're at full health. This will impact all the spells that you use. You tend to not get hit too much with this build, so this is not hard to pull off. And in fact, you could even stack these together and replace the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman if you want to get even more damage with your spells. Magic Scorpion Charm is also a good choice here if you find yourself using Collapsing Stars or Gravitational Missile more if you're out on the landscape. This will increase the damage of that by about 12%. If you're fighting bosses, again, it's a flat 12% increase. So that's really good. It does come with the drawback of taking more damage, which can be kind of detrimental in the DLC. But if you do like those spells and you know you're going to be using those spells in a boss fight or in a certain stretch of the game, consider slotting that one. And then you might consider using Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman also for more protection, especially if you're using the Magic Scorpion Charm. You really can't have too much protection. My kind of strategy with this build is to just try and burn things down quickly and not worry about my health bar. So I don't really like to have that one. But you can't really use Crusade Insignia effectively in boss fights, so it's not one that I would super recommend. And if you're using Blades of Stone, then Magic Scorpion Charm isn't super useful in boss fights either. So you kind of got to have something in that fourth slot. So attributes for this build at 156, we got 50 Vigor, 43 Mind, 3 of that is from our helmet, 10 Endurance, 9 Strength, 12 Dexterity, 80 Intelligence, 25 Faith, and 9 Arcane. You only need 8 Strength for this build and 10 Dexterity. I couldn't get lower than 10 on this because I'm an astrologer, but you only need that amount, so don't put any points in Strength and Dexterity if you can help it. Vigor's at 50 here. I would like this to be higher because I'm in light armor, but at 156, there's just not a lot of stat points to go around, so eventually you want to take this up to 55 or 60. Mind is really high, that way we can cast a lot of spells, particularly in boss fights, without having to pot often, so you can focus on dealing damage to the boss and not managing your FP pool as much. You can definitely take this up higher if you want, just to make your life easier. Intelligence is at 80 to get a lot of damage out of the Carrion Regal Scepter. You can take this up higher eventually to get even more sorcery scaling, since it's a good way to get damage. And maybe eventually you might want to consider swapping your staff to the Prince of Death staff, maybe at like level 250, 270, something like that. If you crank Intelligence and Faith, you'll have even more sorcery scaling if you decide to go that way. And we have 25 Faith here in order to use Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength. Both of these are good. We do have some 100% physical damage spells, so you're going to use Flame Grant Me Strength periodically. When it comes to Flask of Wondrous Physique, Magic Shroud and Cracked here is good if you're doing magic damage in a boss fight. If you decide to go the Blades of Stone route, you might want to swap that out for something else. I like Opaline Hard tier as well for protection, or the Cerulean Hidden tier in order to be able to drain your FP bar with some spells, particularly if you're using Meteorite of Astal, but it's very situational. And when it comes to Great Rune for this build, Radahn's is by far the best choice. This is going to give you extra health, more FP, more stamina. Our endurance is very low in this build because we aren't focusing at all on wearing protection or, attacking a lot. We're simply casting spells, and you can take endurance up eventually if you take this build higher to get more protection if you want. But generally speaking, we don't need a ton of endurance for this build, so I've kind of gone minimal there. But if you take Radahn's, then you're going to gain some extra stamina, which is going to help you out in combat, give you that FP and health. All those things are good. So that wraps up my Gravity Sorcerer build. I think this is a really strong build. This is one of the stronger builds I've made so far. Gravity Mage was already strong, in my opinion, in the base game. Now it's even stronger. Blades of Stone and Gravitational Missile are both strong spells, particularly Blades of Stone. So if you're having trouble with the DLC, I definitely recommend trying this build. It absolutely smashes bosses. And as always, if you have questions or you have other tips, please leave them in the comments below, and I will try and get to them as soon as I can.